Discourse. Very important. More important than most people realize. If you're wondering why I'm holding a Blue Yeti awkwardly aloft as such, just don't question it. It's much easier to just move along in life and not even worry about stuff like that. But anyway, I'm going to be talking about discourse, going to be talking about debates, because I really like arguing on the internet. It's one of my favorite things to do. I think people tend to avoid confrontational discourse because it makes them feel insecure when their beliefs are challenged and they can't easily disarm that challenge. And that, of course, leads to a lot of anger and frustration, which leads to the illusion that arguing with people is a waste of time because nothing ever good comes out of it. But I see it from a different perspective, because it's not that nothing good can come out of it. It's just that the good has to come from within you. You have to be willing to take the steps to make it into an edifying experience. And if you don't do that, then yeah, you're not going to get anything out of it. Like when I started doing it, when I started just, I don't know, arguing about any old topic with people, I started to notice subconsciously that I was an idiot. You know, I wasn't winning anything. And so I thought, well, eventually, you know, at first you just want to ignore that. You just want to move on. You just want to like pretend that you're smart and the other person is stupid. But eventually that illusion starts to wear off, and you start, if you get deep enough into it, you start to be like, okay, I need to actually work on this. And because I really want to talk about things on camera, that's kind of what I wanted to do my whole life. And talk about things that require a lot of thought, I needed to learn how to think. And so I sort of naturally stepped into this role of wanting to get good at arguing. And the internet can be a great training ground for that, because it kind of allows you to strip away all peripheral elements that make it hard to have an actual conversation, and you can just focus on the ideas. So the more I talked to people, the more I became a more trained sophist, and I eventually started to win a few arguments and feel a little bit better about my skills. But eventually, I started to hit a few barriers that were very difficult to get past. And I noticed that these barriers seem to be kind of universal. Everyone has trouble with these barriers. And the first one is simply knowledge. Knowledge! Learning anything is really difficult. That's why people spend over 10 years in school and barely learn anything. Because if you want to learn anything to a deep or substantial level, you're going to have to read. And reading is really boring, especially now in the age of computers where our attention spans have plummeted. Like my attention span is just abysmal. And so I just can't read. I literally just can't read. Okay, maybe not literally. I have managed to get through a few of the books you can see behind me. Probably about 30 of them I have managed to completely read. Out of, I don't know how many are there, 150, 200? Because in order to read, you have to use your eyeballs to track words across a page. It's an activity. It's not just something that you do passively. You have to actively use the muscles in your eyes to track words. And then not only that, but you have to comprehend those words. And not only that, you have to think about those words and interpret them and make sure that you're coming to the right conclusions about them. And even if you've done all of that, at the end of it, you still have to remember what you read, or else there was no point in even reading it in the first place. And that last barrier, remembering what you read, is probably the hardest one, because, you know, I can read a book, like a book about history, like I've read about 30 of them so far, and at the end of it, maybe I can remember a 2-page summary, and then after maybe 6 months, I can remember 3 or 4 facts about the book. For instance, let's try to look at one of these, just picking out one at random. Set my computer down. This is one that I read. Inheritance of Rome. All right. I can remember Only a few things about this. I remember that the Merovingian dynasty was weak, and they had people called MAIORs controlling the Pippinids, or the MAIOR DOMUS. And they eventually became the Carolingians under Charles Martel and his grandson Charlemagne. I remember that. I remember that there were a bunch of Arab scholars that were influenced by Aristotle. I remember a little bit about the caliphates and how the Umayyad Caliphate moved to Spain, although that might have actually been from a different book that I read now that I think about it. Caliphate right there. But that's pretty much it. I pretty much remember nothing else other than the few facts that I just recited. Let's try another one. History of Ancient Egypt, Part 1 by John Romer. Now, this book was really boring because this is like no history. It's all archaeology because this only goes up to the Great Pyramid, which is like nothing. If you know anything about Egypt, you know that like there's no history before the Great Pyramid. So it's all archaeology and it's boring. The one thing I remember, the only one thing that I remember about this book is that John Romer has a different theory about the NARMER palette, which is supposedly about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Although I can't even really remember what his theory about it was. It had something to do with there's being some ritual sacrifice where a bunch of people are killed. That's all I remember. We'll just do one more. How about this one? Britain After Rome, Robin Fleming. I remember like 3 things about this. I think there was gay monks in it at some point, like monks writing about being gay, but they didn't know what it was at the time. I remember there was like there was a lot of stuff here about taxation and tolls and how kings would exact tolls from people, from merchants entering into markets. And I remember the main takeaway, which was that Robin Fleming disagrees with Gildas, which most people do these days, so it's not really that big of a deal, but she basically promotes the idea that the Anglo-Saxon invasion was more of a peaceful migration, which is kind of common sense these days. That's 3 books I remember basically nothing from, and that's pretty much my experience reading. Every time I finish a book, I remember pretty much nothing from it, and the more time that passes after I've read a book, the more I forget. So how do you actually learn anything if reading is so difficult and then remembering what you read is even more difficult? You pretty much can't learn anything unless you're doing it for a specific purpose. Like, for instance, these days I've pretty much decided that my only interest in learning will be for making these videos because that gives me a reason to learn and it gives me a way to kind of record and remember what I've learned. If I'm just idly reading something, I'm not going to remember it, I'm not going to get anything out of it. So the first barrier to good argumentation is knowledge. The second barrier is trust, because even if you do read something in a book, that doesn't mean it's going to be true. And most of the stuff that you read in books is dubious at best, even in history books. Even journals aren't always reliable in that way. Sometimes people just make stuff up for no reason and they don't even know that they're making stuff up. Sometimes people deliberately lie and distort the truth. And then sometimes people just make a mistake in copying something, like they misinterpret it. They think it says one thing, but it says another thing. And then that mistake gets copied by 5 more people and you get this long game of telephone where it just gets more distorted each time. One of the biggest examples of this that I can think of is science journalism, because it is all too common for science journalists to know way more about journalism than about science. And so they'll take these stories that they discover about, like, I don't know, powdered alcohol, and they'll portray it as some revolutionary feat in engineering when it's not. And it doesn't actually mean anything, because powdered alcohol does not actually provide a very convenient source of alcohol for anyone for any purpose. But they'll report on it as if it does, and then you think that it's some big paradigm-shifting event. I think Elon Musk has ridden that wave quite well in recent years. He's pretty much been able to con people into thinking that he's some sort of a genius inventor just because science journalists are stupid enough to fall for his tricks. The most famously idiotic area of science journalism is nutrition, because it seems like, and this is pretty much universally acknowledged by this point, that they can never decide what's good for you and what's bad for you. There's always a new study or a new article out that's claiming something contradictory from the last week. And a lot of this is due to the failure of science journalism to communicate anything. Like, for instance, one example of something that might happen is a scientist writes a report saying that antioxidants are found in the greatest quantity in the American diet in coffee. And then some science journalist will look at that and then totally misinterpret what he's saying, and then write an article saying scientists say that coffee is an excellent source of antioxidants. Just because it's the largest source of antioxidants in the American diet doesn't mean it's a great source of antioxidants. But most people don't know that. Most people just believe whatever they read. So if you don't have trust issues at this point, then you are pretty ignorant, aren't you? For some reason, the biggest meme with nutrition journalism is coconut oil. It seems like coconut oil is one of those ones that just keeps going back and forth. You can't decide whether it's good for you or clogs your arteries. I happen to be on the side of thinking it clogs your arteries, but, you know, that's just my opinion, and it's not really worth anything. But to lay all the blame on simple stupidity would be missing out the bigger picture, which is that a lot of people are very duplicitous, and they will intentionally lie and distort information. For instance, you know, one of the things about nutrition is that if you've got this nutritional maxim that has been believed by scientists for decades, and it's very firm, all it really takes to create doubt and confusion is to basically write one report that contradicts that. And then that can be blown out of proportion, and then it can become this game where you basically believe whatever you want to believe. You believe whatever makes you comfortable, because all information is just arbitrary. When there's so many different contradictory voices, there's no one voice that's very obviously more trustworthy than the others. One way I've heard that nutrition scientists and journalists have managed to mislead people, and this is just something I've heard, I haven't backed this up at all, but cholesterol, right? Serum cholesterol goes on a curve like that, which means that if you already have a lot, you're not going to really increase your amount of serum cholesterol very much by intaking foods that cause that increase, such as foods rich in saturated fat. And so what they'll do if they want to claim that a food doesn't cause a significant increase in saturated fat is they'll pick study participants who already have high serum cholesterol so that their cholesterol doesn't go up very much. Whereas if they pick the people with low serum cholesterol, then you'll get that spike in the curve before it levels out. One very easy way to manipulate data. And like I said, once there's this doubt, suddenly it becomes all about how you feel about the information. Oh, it doesn't matter if it's true exactly, because literally anything could be true because people are saying all different types of things. So what matters is how I feel about it. And so you get people basically just believing whatever they want to believe. For instance, some people turn to veganism because it makes them feel very good about themselves for making a choice to stand out and be different in a way that is morally superior, you know? It makes them feel good that they changed their behavior in order to be more correct and consistent with their ideals. But most people feel better when they don't have to change, when they can keep going along doing the exact same thing they've been doing their whole lives and not have to question anything. And that's why most people turn against veganism. Not because they've actually thought about it, but just because they have this knee-jerk reaction against it, because it makes them feel uncomfortable to think that they've been living their whole lives in a way that is evil, or their whole community is evil, their family is evil, or if not evil, then just stupid, than just being mindless participants in a system of cruelty. They don't like that thought. And so instead of actually addressing it, they just try to cover it up and ignore it because it makes them feel better. Because it's really hard to believe that you are either evil or stupid without running up against the third barrier to good argumentation, which is the ego. I am someone with an extremely fragile ego. It's been that way my whole life. And it's gotten to the point with me where I have developed full-blown social anxiety that's extremely difficult to deal with. The idea of talking to a person can send me panicking, and I wasn't even able to get a job until 2 months ago. So I'm very familiar with the struggles of ego and having to defend that fragile ego from attack. I have it in a more severe way, but everyone has it because everyone has an ego. And an ego, for the sake of this conversation, is the part of your mind that identifies itself as a separate entity from the rest of the universe. If you experience ego death, what you're really experiencing is the diminishing of that tendency to identify as separate, and thus you become more one with everything, in a manner of speaking.
So the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop.
Cosa shop, kare?
Pizza shop. Pizza?
Pizza shop, yes.
Yeah, pizza shop. And says, "Can you make me one with everything?"
But as long as your ego is still around and hasn't died, it's going to cause you a lot of problems, because the ego, I think, just from thinking about it, is an adaptation created as a way to help animals to become more successful in their niches. For instance, if you're a baboon who has a sense of self, then you become a selfish baboon, and you can thus hoard resources for yourself, and that allows you to be more successful and have a better chance of reproducing. And in species like baboons, that ego can create dominance hierarchies, and these dominance hierarchies are enforced by brute strength and cunning. And so therefore, when your ego feels attacked, you feel the need to defend that ego through the means of brute force and cunning. And when your ego is damaged, it hurts really bad. If somebody tramples on you or makes you feel weak in some way, or if somebody causes you to fail at something, it will feel really bad. And for some people, they have the confidence in themselves to respond to that with another attack, either through brute force, which could be in the form of physical violence or just verbal violence, or cunning. They figure out some way to manipulate themselves into a stronger position. For other people, more like me, we don't have that confidence, and so what happens is we just retreat. We know that we can't beat our opponent, so we fall back. And that causes a lot of internal anger, because that anger response doesn't go away. It just gets redirected, and it becomes about hating yourself. Because if you're weak, then you're a drain on resources. There's a reason the runt of the litter gets kicked out of the feeding pile. It's because they're a drain on resources. And you want people to like you so that you have a stronger position, so that you can be a baboon with more security, and security is paramount. People care about security way more than they care about truth. So the problem with ego is that people bring their egos everywhere, and that includes to a discussion. And so if your point of view is challenged, that makes you look and feel weak. And so you end up engaging your ego, and it becomes what used to be a conversation has now become a battle where you have to win. And the great thing about it is that you don't actually have to be right in order to win. All you need to do is convince your ego that you are right, because that gives your ego that sense of security that it craves, security over truth. And because of this, people have learned how to basically just ignore criticism that they don't like. And this criticism, ignorance, can come in 3 different forms. The first form is to become very angry and indignant as a way to basically posture yourself into victory in the manner of the baboon without actually having any substance to back it up.
Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it.
Method number 2 is to just dismiss the criticism because you've found a reason for why you don't have to take the critic seriously. You don't have to respect the critic. And if you don't respect the critic, that gives you an excuse to not pay attention to the criticism.
You're just a kid. You don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about.
Why, thank you.
Method number 3, the most subtle method, is called sophistry. And this is the one I've probably used the most out of these three. Now, you can be an intelligent sophist, or you can be a stupid sophist. The word comes from some Greek word that means like wise man or something, but really you don't have to be smart to use sophistry. The connotation of the word comes from the fact that ancient Greek sophists, rhetoricians basically, were known for using rhetoric for rhetoric's sake rather than in service of finding the truth. Basically using a lot of nitpicking and rhetorical tricks in order to win a debate instead of actually being right. In school, you might have been taught a thing called persuasive writing, and this is basically the essentials of sophistry. It's a way to make your writing seem more correct without actually being more correct. In school, I can remember being taught the appeal to popularity fallacy, which we called bandwagoning. I was also taught appeal to normality, which we called plain folks. And there were other appeals to emotion, appeals to authority. Basically, it's just the appeal method. You appeal to your audience as many times as possible, and eventually they'll find you appealing. And if they find you appealing, they'll listen to you and believe you. But you don't have to be right. You just have to be appealing. And then you're persuasive. So persuasive writing is basically just logical fallacies. And this goes beyond just school. Every institution enshrines logical fallacies in its very DNA. For instance, the legal system is rife with it, intentionally so, because you have to put up as robust a defense as possible if you want to win the argument. And it's all about winning in law. It's not actually about the truth. It's just about whether you can make people think that you're right, because then you've won the case and you get to feel good about yourself and get paid and feel confident in the fact that you've done your end in upholding the law, even if the other person hasn't. And this is the big problem with debates. This is why debates are such a stupid waste of time, because everyone in a debate has an ulterior motive. The ulterior motive is to win. The conversation might be presented as an honest discussion, but it's not, because in order to win, you can't be honest. You have to lie. Because if you're honest, you might actually have to admit to being wrong, or you might have to admit to not knowing something. You basically look weak, and you can't look weak, so you have to mount as much of a defensive posture as possible. You have to smile in a condescending way. You have to seem superior. You have to just be smug, basically. Because if you look like a fool in a debate, then you've not only damaged your ego, but you've damaged your cause. The cause that you care so much about, the cause that has motivated you to get onto this platform and try to convince other people to your side. And you can't betray your cause, so you are actually socially forced and pressured into this position where you need to be right. But even if you're not socially pressured, you still feel this need to defend your cause because your ego has identified itself with your opinions, and this is the big mistake, because your opinions don't matter. I know you think they matter, but they really don't. But the illusion that your opinions matter mean that you have to do your utmost to defend these opinions, because your ego has identified itself with these opinions, and therefore it thinks of these opinions as like the backbone of your identity, that somehow if your opinions fail, that means you've failed and you're bad because your opinions are bad. But that's just a stupid way of thinking about it. If you want to actually, have good opinions, what you have to do is not care about them. What you have to do is let go of the idea that you need to defend them and just accept that your opinions are kind of free-flowing, morphing, changing things that don't really matter in the long run. And the format of the debate encourages this kind of ego identification, because it stipulates that the two people having this conversation are representatives of their cause, and so they're not really allowed to change their opinions, because then they won't be representing that cause anymore. Now, there are some debates where it's a little bit more open and honest, where it's more about two people talking to each other rather than two positions talking at each other. And in these cases, you can sometimes get people who are more honest, who are more willing to actually have a conversation. But I still think that the basic premise of a debate is flawed, because it assumes that both sides have fully formulated, confident opinions, and that's really impossible if both sides are being honest, because both sides can't be correct. And so if both sides have fully thought out their opinions and come to perfectly honest conclusions, well, then they'll both agree with each other anyway. And so a debate kind of becomes a game of spot the liar, but it's impossible to spot the liar when you can't tell who's lying. Sometimes you think you can tell who's lying, but you can't. Because all you're really able to tell is who is cleverest, who is using rhetoric more effectively, who is more persuasive, not who is telling the truth, just who can make it seem like they're telling the truth more. For instance, if you watch Noam Chomsky's debate with William F. Buckley on Firing Line, Noam Chomsky really seems cleverer than Buckley. He seems more able, more knowledgeable. He seems to have better opinions, more well thought out opinions, and he might very well have those, but that doesn't mean that he's correct. That doesn't mean that Buckley is wrong. The only reason you think Buckley is wrong is because he looks wrong. That doesn't mean he's wrong. His propaganda works on me the way conservative propaganda works on a mentally retarded person like Jesse Lee Peterson. It's the same function. Because a debate doesn't tell you who has come to a more holistic and truthful conclusion. It only tells you who is better at arguing a point. But I haven't actually learned anything from watching this debate, because all I see is two people who can't agree on basic premises, which doesn't actually tell me who has the better premise. It just tells me that the matter is up for debate, which I already knew before going into it. So if you're having a debate, you're not being productive, because all you're doing is wasting your time trying to seem correct, instead of doing what you should be doing, which is using a conversation like this as a learning opportunity, as a method of edifying oneself. Or if you're just leagues above your opponent, edifying the other person. If the purpose of discourse is to liberate the truth and enlighten people of it, then why are we wasting our time with this ego battle, watching two people try to win a conversation instead of actually having a conversation? Instead of liberating the truth, you're putting it into cages of ideological purity and competitiveness. So debates are not only a waste of time to hold for the debate participants, but they are also a waste of time for the viewer to watch. Because the only way to actually verify anything that's said in a debate is to read, and we've already gone over the fact that reading is boring and only nerds like reading, and so normal people can't actually do it, or if they do, they're not going to really get much out of it. And because of that, because of the fact that actually fact-checking is pretty much impossible for most people just default to consuming comfort information. Whatever I think seems true, I'm going to believe that. That makes me comfortable. It doesn't really require you to do any work. But in good discourse, in honest discourse, you actually can learn things. And I'm going to talk about the ways that you can have good discourse that is definitely not in the manner of a debate. Good discourse is when the ego is fully set aside and the intellect is fully engaged, because that is the only way to remove bias. And you can make mistakes, that's fine, but you have to be vigilant about trying to correct your own mistakes rather than correcting the mistakes of other people. You can correct other people's mistakes, but only in the manner of helping them to correct their own mistakes. You have to make it about helping the other person. You can't just be doing it as a way to get ego points. Oh, I beat you because I was right and you were wrong and you made a mistake, so therefore I'm better than you. No, it can't be about that. If someone's making a mistake, you have to be like, oh, hey, look, I think you made a mistake and I want to show you so that we can both benefit from that. And you have to always be mindful about your own mistakes. You have to always be willing to correct them. And if you don't do this, then you just end up with a situation where people are talking past each other. This is the most frustrating aspect of watching a debate. A few years ago, I just got so sick of watching debates because they were impossibly bad. The problem is that if you agree with someone and they are not understanding the argument of their opponent, it is one of the most frustrating experiences because this person is just being an idiot when they're supposed to be representing you, and you're like, come on, you're letting me down, man, you're letting me down. So always really try to understand what the other person is saying from their perspective. Like, you don't immediately respond to something as soon as somebody's done talking. Sit with it for a second, think about it, really try to understand it, and then respond. Because otherwise you're just talking past each other and everyone else hates you for it. Oh, and also there's a tendency for people to jump to conclusions about other people and make accusations, which is also really dumb because if you can't fully verify something for certain, then you're making yourself look like a fool by saying it. And there's a very easy remedy for this, which is just to air your suspicions out in the open. If you have a suspicion about something, couch it in terms of being a suspicion rather than an overt accusation. Because a suspicion can be worked out. It's something that can be challenged and then you can sort of resolve it. Whereas an accusation, if an accusation is worked out, then you're either right or you're wrong, which you don't want to start out being wrong. You want to start out being open-minded. And also, people just don't like being accused of things that they don't do. And that can lead to a lot of just ire and acrimony. And that engages the ego. That makes the ego feel attacked, and then you turn it into a battle, which is what you want to avoid. The ultimate goal of good discourse is always to come to an agreement. People mistakenly believe that discourse is about winning. It's not about winning, it's about agreeing. Because the premise should be that the truth is robust and the truth should be understood by everybody. And so the goal shouldn't be to make it seem like the other person doesn't know the truth. The goal should be for both of you to arrive at the truth by talking to each other. And you should never be afraid when your position is attacked, because all that is a sign that you are making a mistake, that your ego has wrongly attached itself to your position. Because if your position were really truthful enough that you understood it with a holistic memory, then you wouldn't be afraid, because the truth is robust, you know? It doesn't get attacked. The truth is steadfast. And so if you're not steadfast, then I'm afraid to tell you this, but you just don't understand the truth. So maybe you need to work on that. Anytime somebody attacks your position and you respond mentally with this kind of, that is your first clue that you're an idiot and you're making a mistake, and you need to correct that behavior, because that is not productive discourse behavior. And if you do this, if you follow all these rules, then you can have a civil conversation and a fun and productive conversation with someone about something as controversial as, for instance, denying the Holocaust. Because if you're having good discourse, then all ideas have a baseline neutrality. Emotion doesn't factor into the picture at all. And if you think of everything with a baseline of neutrality, then all that matters that creates a hierarchy of ideas is how well they hold up to this kind of dialectic, honest inquiry. Asking questions should always be the main focus. And if somebody says something you disagree with, your response shouldn't be immediately to say, you're wrong, you're lying. No. It should be, why do you think that? Because that's honest, isn't it? You're asking a question because there is something to be gleaned. Because you don't know for sure if you're right. So instead of saying, that's wrong, what you need to do is you need to open the door that will lead you to understanding how that person got to that position, and that can lead you to knowing whether you have a position that properly counteracts it or not. So this is a process that's called dialectic, and it's basically where two contradictory ideas agitate against each other, and through this process of agitation, eventually their differences are resolved. And it might be the case that one position is just correct and the other is just incorrect. In that case, it will be resolved as such through that agitation, but it also might be the case that both positions are flawed, but they also have some kernel of truth. In whichever case, this agitation, if done properly with proper dialectic method, it will result in the truth, and that truth should be ideally understood by both parties, although it isn't always, and that's okay. But the goal should always be for both parties to understand it. And through doing this, through having free and open and truthful conversations with other people about things that you wildly disagree on, you can actually become a more intelligent, more worldly person. And it's very important in all this. I've talked about defensive argumentation, but I haven't talked about offensive argumentation. And this is something you want to avoid. Don't offend people. I know that offending people is fun. I love doing it. But if you want to have actual discourse, don't offend people. It's not going to help you out. Because all that does is it triggers that ego defense response, and then you're back to square one. So do whatever you can to make the other person feel comfortable. Make the other person feel smart and confident and prepared. Make the other person feel like they're right even when they're wrong. That's what you want to do. I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I know it goes against everything that idiotic debate culture has taught you over the years, but it's true, and it works, and that's how I know it's true. And I'm going to be recording the rest of this from down here on the floor because my camera has run out of charge and I need to plug it in. And I'm plugging it in from an outlet that's near to the floor. So I'm going to be crouching down for the rest of this video. I've been framing this whole conversation from the perspective of it being an alternative to debate culture, but the truth is that this stuff is universal. This is principles that you can apply in your daily life. And in daily life, what you'll notice is that when people disagree with each other, there's a lot of emotional baggage that goes along with it, because these are people who know each other very well, and they have these preconceived judgmental ideas about each other that they bring to every interaction. And this can result in a lot of immediate hostility. And hostility is something that is just evil. You should just avoid it at all costs when you're dealing with people in your life. Do not be hostile. Even to just people you don't even know who are annoying you, just don't be hostile. Don't make them mad, and don't be mad. And the reason I say this is because anything, literally anything that can be communicated through anger can be communicated better without that anger. Now, anger can help sort of unlock certain things in a way. It can sort of loosen up your mind and get you to process things that you were repressing. And this is why sometimes people need to vent to each other, but don't vent with the premise that you're having a conversation. Vent with the premise that you're venting. And I know that's a little bit difficult, but you gotta try to do it, because hostility and anger is just unacceptable in your private life. I'm telling you this. I'm prescribing this for you because I know it works. It's universal. In discourse, really the only appropriate avenue for anger is entertainment. You can have a sort of discursive style of entertainment where being angry can be really funny, and that can communicate a message better in a more impactful way. Some of my favorite entertainers are people who communicate their ideas and perspectives about life in an angry manner. And I'm kind of doing that in this video a little bit too. That's part of the performance. It's part of hamming it up. But outside of entertainment purposes, anger is always just a massive hindrance. It's never really useful for anything. There is a stark shortage of pure, honest intent in discourse. And honest curiosity. Curiosity is such an undervalued trait. In fact, I think for education, we should focus on the 3 C's. I came up with these and they just happen to all start with C, accidentally. The first, of course, is curiosity. The second is critical thinking. And the third is compassion. Now, with these 3 C's, I think education could skyrocket in terms of actual applicability and usefulness. But curiosity is such an important element of it, because if you're not actually curious, then you have an ulterior motive to having a conversation. And ulterior motives are never good, because usually you don't even know that you have them, and it makes it impossible to get anything done. But people don't actually seem to be curious. They don't seem to be interested in learning. Rather, people seem to be more interested in proving what they already know. Because, of course, you know everything, right? There's nothing that you actually have to learn. It's not possible that you were ever misled by something you read. It takes a great deal more intelligence to be receptive to ideas that don't immediately comply with your own. To be receptive and open to people who are, frankly, offensive to you. And honestly, the response of being offended by an idea is something that I think is extremely stupid, and I've worked in myself to try to minimize that as much as possible. Because an idea isn't offensive. An application of an idea can be offensive, but an idea itself is just an idea, and it needs to be worked out honestly as an idea. But people take great pride in being intolerant, and this is the core of political correctness. Political correctness is when people stifle the intellect, people stifle genuine curiosity and interest in learning in favor of maintaining something. In political correctness, you're allowed to have conversations, but only as long as those conversations strengthen the narrative that's already in place. There's a misconception about debates, that debates are a format that encourages 2 ideas to compete against each other. Wrong. It encourages 2 people to compete against each other, and the ideas are just a peripheral element that can be used as a tool to really achieve some sort of an ego victory. If you want a true competition between ideas, you have to remove the human competitive element from it entirely, and then it becomes just a free-form discussion. If it's all about the ideas, make it about the ideas. Don't make it about the persons involved. So for all of these reasons, I will never participate in a debate. You will never see me debase myself to the level of actually debating somebody. I might have a conversation, but never a debate. Debate moderators are just another way to stifle intellect. They don't actually help contribute to anything. All they can do is basically corral idiots into talking about the topic of the conversation. The last thing that I want to see is some third-wheeled babysitter telling a participant that he only has 1 minute to describe something that takes 5 minutes to talk about in even anywhere approaching holistic detail.
Give me a fucking break. 1 minute left. 1 minute fucking left. You're gonna give me fucking 1 minute? Look at that fucking sign right there. 1 minute.
But if the people participating in a debate are so stupid that they need to be corralled, maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem isn't the fact that the debate isn't unmoderated. Maybe the problem is that you need better participants. Why would I waste my time watching 2 idiots talk to each other when I could be watching 2 smart people talk to each other? There's no need for debate moderators. So while I will never participate in a debate, I might participate in actual discussions, and maybe, just maybe, we could change the face of discourse, at least in the online space, by following these basic rules.